Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to find out they've been hiding a devastating secret? For me, it was a quiet Wednesday afternoon. I decided to come home early, hoping to surprise my wife, only to be blindsided by a betrayal that ran deeper than anything I could have imagined. Join me as I take you through that unforgettable moment, the pain that followed, and how I found the strength to pick up the pieces for myself and my son. My name is Alex, 26, and my wife, Amy, is the same age. We've been together practically all our lives. Growing up in a small town just outside of Dallas, we were childhood sweethearts from the age of 13, drawn together in that unique way only young love can create. I remember the first time I met Amy at a middle school volunteer event, her bright eyes and warm smile instantly captivating me. I was just a nervous kid, fumbling my way through an introduction, but Amy saw something in me, and we quickly became inseparable. I never would have guessed that this sweet girl would one day become my wife and the mother of my son. Our bond only deepened over the years. We went through high school together, shared late-night study sessions, and spent weekends camping with friends or cheering each other on at school events. Amy was always there, standing beside me as we tackled everything that came our way. By the time we graduated, we'd grown so close that it felt only natural to continue our journey together in college. We chose the same university, eager to keep building a life side by side. Unlike most high school romances, we never took a break or hit a rough patch that separated us. To everyone in town, we were the perfect couple, the kind of love story people read about. After college, I proposed to her on a beach in California, and we were married in a spring ceremony surrounded by friends and family. Our journey together was just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see what our future held. Now, 4 years into our marriage, we have a bright and lively 2-year-old son named Ethan. Ethan is the spitting image of Amy, with her sparkling eyes and infectious laughter. Being young parents isn't without its challenges, but he fills our lives with so much joy. Amy always teases me that Ethan inherited my mischievous grin, but all I see is her in his every smile. As for work, I'm in pharmaceutical sales, a job that keeps me on the road often, meeting clients across state lines. My career can be demanding, but I make it a priority to carve out time for Amy and Ethan whenever I'm back home. Amy, on the other hand, works as an engineer, a steady 9-to-5 position that provides some balance to the family schedule. Each morning, she leaves early for work, and by the afternoon, she's picking Ethan up, spending the rest of the day taking him to the park, reading his books, and soaking up these precious moments together. We're incredibly fortunate that my mom lives just 5 minutes away. She's always happy to help us out, watching Ethan whenever we need a break or when our schedules overlap. Knowing we have that kind of support has been invaluable. Growing up, I had the privilege of having Mike as a strong, positive role model in my life. When I was 15, my mom remarried, and Mike came into our lives with the kind of warmth and energy that left an impression on everyone he met. Mike had been a college basketball player back in his day, even spending some years overseas playing professionally before coming back to settle in Dallas. Now at 63, Mike works as a roofing contractor, and while his work has its fair share of physical demands, he's never lost that youthful spirit. He's the type of guy who'd still shoot hoops with the neighborhood kids or offer to help a neighbor with a leaky roof on his day off. For me, Mike has always been more than just a stepdad. He's been a true father figure, someone I look up to and rely on for advice. He's the one who taught me how to change a tire, handle a toolbox, and keep my head up when life gets rough. I couldn't imagine my life without him. His presence was so important that, when I started dating Amy, it was crucial that she and Mike also formed a strong connection. To my delight, they did. Amy and Mike share a friendship that goes back to our high school years. When Amy and I started dating, she'd often come over to study or have dinner with my family, and Mike took to her instantly. Mike's charisma made him easy to like, and he always went out of his way to make Amy feel like part of our family. Their bond grew naturally over the years as he became a steady, supportive presence for both of us. From backyard barbecues to Thanksgiving dinners, Amy and I spent countless evenings with him, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, and appreciating the stability he brought to our lives. Now, As Amy and I have built a life together, the connection between her and Mike has only grown. He's more than a stepfather to her, he's a confidant and a friend. We often gather for family dinners, with Mike taking on the role of Ethan's playful grandpa, chasing him around the yard and teaching him how to toss a basketball. Those nights bring a warmth that makes our family feel complete. They're a reminder of the closeness we all share, the bond that seems unbreakable, built on years of love, trust, and memories. For me, Amy and Ethan are everything. They're my pride, my happiness, and my purpose. Life here in Dallas, surrounded by family and close friends, feels as solid as a rock. We have our routines, our traditions, and the quiet comfort that comes from knowing you have a family who loves you. But sometimes, even when everything appears perfect on the surface, there are hidden cracks that go unnoticed, things that slowly begin to unravel without you even realizing it. Looking back now, I can see how easy it was to miss the signs, to ignore the subtle shifts. I had no idea that the life we had built together, the life I thought was unbreakable, could start to crumble at any moment, leaving me blindsided by a reality I never saw coming. It started subtly a few months back. Small, nearly unnoticeable changes in Amy's habits began to emerge, details I wouldn't have caught if we hadn't been married for so long. Amy had always been someone who prided herself on simplicity. She was the kind of woman who could wear a pair of jeans and an oversized sweater, throw her hair into a messy ponytail, and still look stunningly beautiful. We shared a laugh more than once about how she'd forget to buy makeup for months at a time, saying she was too busy for that fuss. But lately, something shifted. I noticed the first sign one evening when she came home a little later than usual, wearing a new blouse that hugged her figure. She seemed a bit more polished, a touch more refined, like she had just stepped out of a catalog. I complimented her, joking that I felt like I'd stumbled into one of those old-school romance novels. She just smiled at me and said, "I'm just trying something new, that's all." I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was trying to add a little flair to her wardrobe. She looked beautiful, after all, and who was I to question it? Then, it became more than just a one-off purchase here or there. Her closet seemed to expand overnight with newer, more sophisticated clothes, perfectly matched with accessories I didn't remember her owning. Suddenly, she was styling her hair differently too, soft waves that framed her face in ways I hadn't seen before. Even her routine was different. She began getting up earlier on workdays, taking extra time with her hair and makeup. On the weekends, she was no longer in a rush to throw on sweats for breakfast. Instead, she'd slip into something new, casually yet chic, even if she was just heading to the local market for groceries. She also started using a new perfume, one that filled the room with a rich, bold scent that lingered well after she'd left. It was surprising, Amy had always been partial to light, subtle fragrances before. When I asked about it, she laughed and brushed it off. "Just having a little fun," she'd say. Her explanation didn't settle the unease growing in me, but I shrugged it off, not wanting to seem overly suspicious. Then, the changes in her schedule began. Amy was suddenly staying late at work, calling home with a quick "I've got a last-minute meeting" or "there's this project that needs extra hands." Now, Amy had always been dedicated to her career, but she'd also always kept a careful balance. She loved her downtime at home, winding down on the couch with a movie or reading with Ethan nestled beside her. But now, nights with the family became fewer and farther between, and when she was home, her mind often seemed elsewhere. At first, I reasoned with myself that it was the nature of her job. But it was more than just the hours, it was the way she'd respond to my check-ins. Where we'd once exchanged texts throughout the day, sharing little details or funny things we'd seen, her responses were now brief, with a tone that seemed, well, distant. I'd call just to hear her voice, maybe get a quick story about her day, but more often than not, she'd cut the call short with a vague, "Sorry, work's just so busy." The part that got to me was how she said it, her voice somehow detached, like she was already elsewhere. I remember one night, after she'd come home late again, we were lying in bed, the room filled with the familiar quietness of night. I reached over, taking her hand, hoping she'd open up, share whatever it was that was weighing on her. She smiled faintly, but I noticed her fingers didn't wrap around mine like they used to. We talked briefly, but her answers to my questions felt more like polite responses than genuine conversation. It was as if a wall had been built, and I didn't know how or why it was there. One weekend, I tried to surprise her. I planned a simple day trip, a drive down to the lake where we'd go in the summers, hoping that getting away from the routine might help us reconnect. She smiled when I told her, but the spark in her eyes wasn't there. She agreed to go, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. Even as we walked along the shoreline, our son's laughter echoing around us, Amy seemed distant, her gaze focused somewhere far beyond the horizon. That was when I felt the first pang of real worry. The Amy I knew wouldn't let anything get in the way of family time, especially not out here, in a place we always loved. That day by the lake, the warmth between us felt like it was slipping away, leaving something hollow in its place. A few weeks later, there was another moment, seemingly small but profound in its own way. She mentioned an old friend she was meeting up with for coffee one evening. I didn't think much of it, even helped her pick out an outfit and watched her leave with a smile. Later that night, I ran into her friend at the local grocery store. Surprised, I casually brought up the supposed meetup, only to learn they'd made no such plans. That night, when Amy came home, I asked her how the visit went. She paused, visibly caught off guard, before giving a vague answer that didn't quite line up. The unease settled in deeper. Was she hiding something? I didn't press further, afraid of the answer I might receive. But the encounter stayed with me, casting a shadow over every interaction we had afterward. Things got even stranger whenever Mike, my stepfather, was around. Mike had been a fixture in my life since I was 15 when my mom remarried him. He'd always been the type to fill any room with his warm energy, cracking jokes and sharing stories from his days as a basketball player. Amy and Mike got along well. They'd bonded over shared interests in sports, especially basketball, and we often spent weekends together with him. He adored Amy like a daughter, or so I thought. But recently, Amy seemed different around him. I began to notice the subtle tension in her gaze whenever Mike was in the room. It was barely perceptible at first, like she was just a little uncomfortable. But soon, it was unmistakable. She'd avoid his gaze, where her cheeks would flush slightly if he made a joke directed at her. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just Amy feeling a bit self-conscious, but I couldn't deny that something about her body language was off, something that made me feel an uncomfortable tightness in my chest whenever I saw them together. As the weeks passed, small lies and inconsistencies started cropping up. One afternoon, Amy mentioned she'd be meeting an old friend from college for dinner. I didn't think much of it. In fact, I even helped her pick out an outfit and watched her leave, excited for her to reconnect with someone who had been important to her. But that evening, while grabbing groceries, I ran into that very friend at a nearby store. We exchanged greetings, and I casually mentioned how nice it was that she and Amy were meeting up after so long. The friend's face fell into confusion, and she responded, "Oh, we hadn't planned anything for tonight." I could feel my heart sink, but I managed to keep my composure, quickly ending the conversation and heading home, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. When I confronted Amy that night, she hesitated before giving me a vague explanation, her words feeling rehearsed and insincere. The tension in our house became thick, palpable, as I grappled with the realization that the trust one had in my wife was slipping through my fingers. Even my mother sensed something was wrong. At a family dinner one evening, I noticed the look on her face as she watched Amy and Mike exchange a brief, almost furtive glance. After the dinner ended, she pulled me aside, her voice low and careful, asking, "Is everything all right with you and Amy?" I tried to assure her that everything was fine, blaming it all on work stress, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't convinced. Then, the late-night calls and messages began. Amy's phone, usually left out on the kitchen counter or in the living room, now became something she kept close by, always in her pocket or face down on the table. One evening while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed with a message preview that caught my eye. "Can't wait for tomorrow," winky face, from a number that wasn't saved. I felt my pulse quicken as I stared at the screen, a mix of shock and dread washing over me. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was just a colleague being overly friendly and not to worry. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but something about her tone, her sudden defensiveness, only fueled my suspicions further. It was like each conversation added another layer of doubt, another barrier between us that I couldn't break through. As the days wore on, I became increasingly aware of my own desperation to understand what was happening. I'd catch myself watching her, noting every small detail, the way she'd flinch when I'd ask too many questions, the way she'd excuse herself to check her phone. Each little inconsistency gnawed at me, leaving me haunted by a feeling of betrayal I couldn't yet prove, but couldn't shake either. The life we'd built together, once so solid, now felt like it was crumbling from the inside, and I was left wondering if I'd ever truly know the truth. It was a Wednesday afternoon, a rare one, actually, without any last-minute calls or urgent emails. I'd wrapped up meetings with clients earlier than expected, so with a smile and a spark of spontaneity, I decided to surprise Amy by coming home early. As I drove into our quiet suburban neighborhood, a picture-perfect place with meticulously trimmed lawns and well-kept driveways, I saw Mike's truck parked out front of our house. The sight struck me as odd. Mike, my stepdad, usually didn't visit unannounced. In fact, he never came by unless we'd arranged for him to swing by for dinner or a family event. I pushed aside the twinge of unease, chalking it up to my surprise. Maybe he was dropping something off or had a quick question for Amy. It could be anything simple, I thought. Still, I parked down the block, wanting to make my entrance a little more dramatic, imagining Amy and Mike's surprised faces when they'd see me. I entered through the side door that led straight into the kitchen. Expecting to hear their voices from the living room or maybe the muffled sound of a football game playing on the TV, I was instead met with an eerie silence that filled the house like an unwelcome guest. The only sounds came faintly from upstairs, subdued noises that raised every hair on the back of my neck. For a moment, I stood frozen by the kitchen island, listening. I wanted to believe it was just Amy talking on the phone or maybe Mike fixing something up in one of the guest rooms. But the sounds didn't fit. They were low, muffled voices, intertwined with something else, something unmistakably intimate. A queasy feeling began to stir in my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe, telling myself I was jumping to conclusions. I took a step forward, then another, slowly making my way up the stairs. Each step seemed louder than the last, mirroring the wild beat of my heart, until I was standing in the hallway, only a few feet away from our bedroom. The sounds grew clearer, sending a sharp, cold realization through me. There was no mistaking it, the voices, the hushed tones, all came from our room at the end of the hall. I stopped at the door, gripping the handle tightly, wrestling with the impulse to turn and leave. But something deep inside me, a force stronger than the pain brewing in my chest, pushed me to confront whatever lay on the other side. I knew I had to face the truth. I opened the door. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching endlessly, as I took in the scene before me. There, on the bed I shared with Amy, were two people I trusted more than anyone else in the world, my wife, and my stepdad, Mike. I stood frozen, breathless, as the reality of their betrayal hit me like a blow to the gut. They were oblivious to my presence, wrapped up in each other, lost in a world that excluded everything and everyone else. For a surreal moment, it felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart, like a scene from a nightmare I was desperate to wake up from. But this wasn't a nightmare. It was my reality. In that excruciating instant, everything I believed in shattered into pieces. I closed the door as silently as I could, unable to confront them, the pain too raw to bear. I stumbled back down the stairs, numb, each step feeling heavier than the last, until I found myself back in my car, struggling to process the betrayal I had just witnessed. That night, after the initial shock from the afternoon's discovery had settled into a smoldering anger, I confronted Amy. It was late, the clock edging toward midnight, and the house felt different somehow, cold and hollow, despite the familiar, comfortable surroundings of our living room. Amy sat across from me on the couch, her posture tense and uncertain. She avoided my eyes, twisting her hands nervously on her lap, her gaze flickering to everything in the room except me. I forced myself to stay calm, though every word felt like it was being pulled from a raw wound. The betrayal was fresh, but I had to know the truth. I needed to understand how someone I'd shared everything with could tear apart everything we'd built. Why? I demanded, my voice cold. Why would you betray me with someone I've treated as family? Amy opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Her response was feeble, evasive, as though she were trying to dismiss the enormity of what she'd done. I needed something different, she muttered, as if that statement would somehow soften the blow. The words rang hollow, lacking any real justification, and each syllable only intensified the sense of betrayal. Her explanation was thin, a flimsy attempt to paint over the wound she'd inflicted. I pressed her for details, desperate to find some kind of understanding. As I asked her to elaborate, the answers she gave became more vague, each reply an echo of her evasiveness. When I demanded, "How long has this been going on?" her responses turned slippery, refusing to give a clear answer. She'd look down and mumble phrases like, "I'm not sure when it started," or "it just happened." The longer I questioned her, the more frustrated I became. It felt as if she were holding on to the truth, guarding it jealously, keeping it as a twisted secret just for herself. A dark thought gnawed at me. How long had this been happening right under my nose? Both she and Mike had been part of my life for so long. The idea that this affair could have spanned years haunted me. I began imagining it happening while we were planning our wedding, or even while we painted Ethan's nursery in preparation for his arrival. I couldn't shake the possibility that this relationship with Mike might have been interwoven into the very fabric of our lives together. With every dodge, with every vague answer, it became clear that Amy was unwilling, or unable, to give me the closure I desperately needed. She was protecting something, but what? A deep, unrelenting bitterness clawed at my heart as I realized that I might never truly know how deep the betrayal ran. And in that realization, I faced an unexpected truth. Knowing the full story wouldn't ease the pain. The betrayal itself was already etched too deeply into my soul. As she spoke, I was flooded with memories, snapshots of our life that had once brought me joy but now seemed tainted. I remembered the weekend we spent redecorating the nursery, her laughter filling the room as we painted stars on the ceiling for Ethan. Had Mike's shadow been looming over us even then? Had he been lingering in her thoughts while we picked out baby names or chose our wedding vows? Each memory twisted into something dark and painful. Amy's silence in the face of my questions left me with only my own guesses, and each one cut deeper than the last. I recalled family gatherings when Mike had been there, his laughter blending in with ours, his presence woven into our lives as a steady, trusted figure. How many times had they shared a glance that I'd missed, a silent exchange right in front of me? Had I been the oblivious fool all along, blind to signs that everyone else could see? The thought of our friends and family drifted into my mind, especially my mother, whose health had begun to falter over the last few years. She'd always thought of Amy as her own daughter and Mike as her steadfast partner, the man who had stood by her through the ups and downs of her later years. The realization of what this would do to her pressed on me like a physical weight. The devastation of Amy's betrayal wasn't just about me, it radiated outward, engulfing my family. My mom, who had always been a stable presence in my life, was crushed. Learning that her husband, the man she had trusted to be a father figure to me, had been involved in such a betrayal was a blow none of us could have anticipated. I could see it in her eyes, the way the news weighed on her. She didn't say much at first, but there were moments I'd catch her looking out the window, lost in thought, with a sadness I hadn't seen in her before. The shock was too much for my mother to bear, and she ended up in the hospital. I spent every moment by her side during those days, determined to care for her and shield her from the pain her husband's betrayal had caused. Faced with the harshness of reality, I knew our family needed to be cleansed of the people who had broken it. Once she was stabilized, I knew I had to make a decision about Amy and Mike's place in our lives. I went home and confronted them both. There was no anger left, just a need for them to be gone. I made it clear that they were no longer welcome in our lives or our home. Amy pleaded for a second chance, but I stood firm. I'd learned that some lines, once crossed, could never be undone. Mike tried to apologize, but I refused to hear it. I knew that for my mother's sake, for my son's sake, and for my own, It was time to end the toxicity they'd brought into our family. The pain of it felt heavier knowing that it wasn't just my world that had been upended. For my mom, the betrayal went beyond the personal. It was a rupture of the family she had worked so hard to build, to nurture, to hold together. She'd welcomed Amy with open arms from the start, treating her like the daughter she'd never had, sharing family recipes and creating traditions that we all thought would carry on for generations. My mom was heartbroken, not only for me, but for the future we all thought was secure and safe within the confines of our family. Now, it felt as if it had all been a lie. I'd always taken pride in being a good husband and father, someone dependable, someone who did his best to put family first. But after discovering Amy's betrayal, I couldn't help but question everything. Was there something I hadn't done, something I'd missed that had driven her away? In the long, lonely hours of sleepless nights, I found myself obsessively replaying every detail of our relationship, wondering if I had failed in some essential way. One fear gnawed at me relentlessly, one I could barely admit even to myself. To put it to rest, I decided to have a DNA test done for our son, Ethan. It felt terrible to even question it, but I needed to be sure. The relief I felt when the results came back confirming that Ethan was, indeed, my son was immense. But even that small certainty couldn't completely restore the confidence I'd lost. With each passing day, I felt myself shrinking, consumed by a sense of inadequacy I'd never experienced before. The person I'd once been, the person who loved fiercely and trusted without question, felt like a stranger to me now. The divorce process felt like walking through a long, dark tunnel, and yet, it was the only way out of the pain that had consumed my life. Each meeting with the lawyer, each form I signed, and every decision about custody arrangements made it all feel more real. There were days when it felt unbearable, but I knew this was a necessary step toward healing. I had to create a life for myself and Ethan, one where we could both find peace. I was determined to be there for my son, to shield him from as much of the fallout as I could. At first, the weight of everything was overwhelming. I moved into a small apartment not far from our old neighborhood in Dallas, wanting to keep Ethan's routine as normal as possible. Our place was modest, 2 bedrooms, with a little patio where Ethan loved to play. The rooms were bare, a stark contrast to the family home we'd once shared, but I decided to look at it as a blank canvas, a space where we could start fresh. I hung up a few of Ethan's favorite drawings on the walls and bought some second-hand furniture to fill the space. Slowly, the apartment began to feel like our own, a little haven where we could both begin to rebuild. Adjusting to life as a single dad wasn't easy. For years, my identity had been so wrapped up in being a husband and father that I'd lost touch with the parts of myself that were solely mine. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized that I had an opportunity here, a chance to reconnect with myself. I started focusing on things that I'd once loved but had set aside, like photography and hiking. I'd take Ethan on little weekend trips, just the 2 of us, exploring the parks and trails around Dallas. It wasn't much, but those quiet moments with him, watching him marvel at the world, seeing him find joy in simple things, were grounding for me. He became my anchor, reminding me of the love that was still there, unshaken by everything else that had fallen apart. Therapy became a regular part of my routine, a safe place where I could process the betrayal and work through the hurt that still lingered. My therapist encouraged me to focus on self-compassion, to let go of the guilt and the endless questioning of what I could have done differently. It was a slow journey, but I found that, bit by bit, I was starting to reclaim parts of myself I thought were lost forever. I was learning that the pain, while a part of my story, didn't have to define me. Eventually, I reached a point where I could look toward the future with cautious optimism. There were still moments of doubt, but I was learning to navigate them with a newfound resilience. Friends and family rallied around us, filling our lives with warmth and laughter that I'd once feared was gone. I took comfort in their presence, in the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that I had a support system ready to help me rebuild. I knew that the scars from this experience would always be with me, but I also knew that they would fade with time. Ethan deserved a father who could look forward, not back. And I, too, deserved a chance to create a life filled with love, joy, and possibility, one where I could eventually open my heart again. Over time, her resilience shone through. She found peace in the quiet, everyday moments spent with Ethan and me, knowing that she still had family to cherish and love. She rediscovered joy in a life that no longer held the weight of betrayal, filling her days with the warmth of the people who truly cared for her. With her love and strength, she showed me that even the deepest wounds could heal, and together, we began our journey toward a future filled with genuine love, trust, and peace.